Before we begin, we'd like to give special thanks to all of our sponsors for making this event possible each year. Specifically, thank you to CRL FormFox for being our title sponsor for 6 consecutive years. And thank you to our platinum sponsors, Psychmedics, OraSure Technologies, Quest Diagnostics, and Veriforce. Hello, and thank you for joining us for another session of Day with DISA. Thank you so much for participating in this session. This will be on safety and regulatory updates with the American Trucking Association, or the ATA. Today, we're joined by Dan Horvath, Senior Vice President of Regulatory and Safety Policy at the ATA. Dan, first off, congrats on the promotion, and second, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Thomas. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we jump into the presentation, I want to remind everyone of a couple of housekeeping items. If you have any questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom right of the player. If we're unable to answer your question today, we will reach back out to you after Day with DISA. Additionally, we're going to make a copy of this presentation available for download on the Materials tab at the end of the session. With that being said, Dan, the floor is yours.
All right. Once again, Thomas, thanks again for having me back, and to the folks at DISA for inviting me year after year to present. I assume I haven't bored you too much over the years, so always glad to be here. But with you know, if you listened in on my updates before from ATA, primarily what I always try and do is give a little bit of a lay of the land from a regulatory perspective on some rulemakings that have just emerged over the past year, and really, as we kick off things in the beginning of the year, what we may see going throughout 2024. So with that, I'm going to focus on just a couple of items today, and certainly with the disclaimer that it's not all inclusive. It's really what I picked out as being most relevant in the trucking world today. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask those as well. But without further ado, I will kick things off and get into the meat and bones of the presentation. So the first thing I want to talk about is what's called safety fitness determination. And this is often referred to in a lot of different, like true government speak. It's has a lot of different names and acronyms and all that fun stuff that goes with it. So safety fitness determinations, really the easiest way to think of this is your motor carrier safety rating. And currently today, that's one of 3 things. That's satisfactory, conditional, or unsatisfactory. And that's been in place for many, many years, and it's often been criticized by outside parties such as the National Transportation Safety Board and other groups that really looked into the rating process that FMCSA uses and said, is it effective in identifying motor carriers that have safety deficiencies in place? So this is a long way of saying, in August of last year, FMCSA published what's called an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. And when we're talking about the regulatory rule and any rulemakings that come out, an advance notice is the highest level of a rulemaking process, and really what's often the first step in any rulemaking process to develop a rule. You don't always have an advance notice. Sometimes you start with just a notice of proposed rulemaking. But in this case, the advance notice is a high-level look, and really it's a proposal from FMCSA that says, we want to change the safety fitness rating process. But before we propose what we want to do with it, let's ask for motor carriers' feedback. Let's ask for the industry's feedback to incorporate that into what would be the notice of proposed rulemaking. And that's what they did in August of last year. They published the ANPRM. The primary goal was to obtain comments on new methodology to determine when a motor carrier is not fit to operate a CMV. And I put some screen grabs there on the PowerPoint slide in front of you. This is directly from the CSA SMS website, where you see motor carrier safety rating that I pulled. They have a satisfactory safety rating. And one of the primary purposes of this rulemaking was to alter what the current 3-tiered system we have in place today of satisfactory, conditional, unsat, and propose alternatives to that. DOT also looked at the actual methodology that helps the motor carrier or determines what the motor carrier safety rating actually is. So for any of you that have been through a safety audit before, you know that you have the auditor come in, they'll spend a couple days with you. They are primarily going through your paperwork that can range from driver qualification files to hours of service records, then to your vehicle maintenance. And it's primarily, well, not exclusively, but it's primarily a paperwork review. FMCSA is proposing ways to enhance that process to ensure that whatever safety rating a motor carrier is assessed is truly accurate of their operation. And again, because this was an ANPRM, it was a lot of broad questions, a lot of considerations. One of the biggest ones that we kind of raised concerns with from ATA's perspective was the question was asked, should we use CSA SMS scores as part of a safety rating? And you know, we responded. We've had a lot of concerns, and I'll talk a little bit about this on the next slide, but we've had a lot of concern with CSA over the years and its accuracy. There's been numerous studies to show that a CSA SMS score really is really not indicative of a motor carrier safety culture. There's a lot of flaws with it. It doesn't produce future crash risks. So we ultimately sent in our feedback to FMCSA that they should not include CSA SMS scores in the methodology. One of the other questions they asked was about safety technologies, and this is an interesting concept. We've been talking about this a little bit more and more lately, but the question is surrounding the idea that if a motor carrier puts safety technologies into their fleet that are above and beyond what's required by the regulations. So speed limiters, for instance. Speed limiters are not yet required by DOT regulations. If a fleet has speed governors in place, should they be incentivized or should they be credited for that safety technology? Drive cameras is another common one that comes up all the time. For a fleet that has cameras in place, should they be rated differently than a fleet that doesn't? So that was an open-ended question that we provided feedback that we like the concept, we like the idea. There's just a lot of specific ideas that need fleshed out as part of the rulemaking. And then another one, which we dived into as well, was driver behaviors. Should driver behaviors, and think of that in the case of moving violations, speeding violations, on-road performance, should that be rated differently than your paperwork violations? And in our opinion, it should be, but there should be some considerations to it as well. For instance, we got a great example from a fleet that said, we have a very little tolerance for drivers who have dangerous driving activities. So for instance, if you have an excess speed violation where you're going, say, 15 or above, the carrier terminates that driver. And I think that's a good plan to have in place in some cases. But during an audit, should that carrier be rated higher because they had the driver that had the violation, but they took immediate action, versus maybe a carrier that doesn't have a plan in place to address that? So while these are straightforward ideas, they're really not straightforward answers as far as what the DOT should do with it. So we, in our comments, and this was a fun task to write because we primarily responded back to DOT, and these are public. These you can read these at any time. But to say that, listen, we like the idea with a lot of it, but here are considerations that you should have to address as part of the rulemaking process. Certainly, if a carrier has no policies or plans in place and they're letting their drivers do whatever, then we think that that's a safety issue. But if a carrier has a plan in place, then a minority of those drivers that have serious safety infractions while on the road shouldn't overall rate them as a motor carrier and how they are in their safety performance. So we filed comments on this. They were due November 29th. The next logical step in this process would be a notice of proposed rulemaking. There's no projected date for that at this time. And quite frankly, this is a big lift on the agency. I mean, this is one heck of a rulemaking. And the agency, it's in their best interest, obviously, to do it right. So I think it's going to take a little bit of time for them to sift through all the feedback and figure out what exactly they're going to do with it. And in any case, the next publication would be another proposal. We're not going to see a final rule on this in the next steps. It's going to be another proposal. at which point they'll narrow down very specifically and figure out exactly just what they want to do, and that's when they propose it. I should add one more thing on this. I kind of glanced over on the actual rating system. So one of the concepts that was introduced early on was, instead of having that three-tiered system of satisfactory, conditional, or unsatisfactory, DOT proposed a two-tier system where either you're fit or you're unfit. And we like the idea of that being narrowed down, but we kind of told FMCSA, don't put the cart ahead of the horse here. Let's figure out the meat and bones of the rating process before we move forward with that. So interesting to say nonetheless, and we'll see what DOT does with that going forward. So related, and I kind of hit on this as I talked about safety fitness determinations, we had another big rulemaking in 2023, and that was the long-awaited proposal to the changes to the CSA SMS system. That came out in February, a Valentine's Day gift from the agency on that, where DOT published a notice and request for comment on the proposed changes. I'd say the biggest part of that proposal was that DOT announced they would not be going forward with their original plan methodology changes, which centered around what was called IRT. Many of you might remember this. IRT was discussed for numerous years, and DOT has ultimately decided to scrap that plan, but said all is not lost. We learned a lot about IRT when we were testing it, and we think that there are things that we can apply from the IRT methodology to the current system we have in place. So instead of a complete revamp of CSA SMS, looking at ways to take what's currently part of the process today and make it better and more accurate. So we filed supportive comments to that process. There's no timeline on the next steps with this. There were a lot of considerations with simplifying CSA SMS. For instance, there are several hundred violations that are included in CSA SMS today. The agency proposed narrowing that down to just about a little over 100 violations, and really focusing on violations that have a direct correlation to crash risk, which is something we've said from day one. And very similar to safety fitness determinations, a lot of what CSA rates are really what you would consider paperwork violations. And that's not to discredit that paperwork violations don't, in some cases, have a correlation to crash risk, but really when you're looking at rating a carrier and rating their on-road performance, let's make sure that whatever we're giving that carrier a score in has a direct correlation to crash risk, which was really the genesis of a lot of the government studies and everything that came about to be. So no timeline on that. I did want to just flag that it is active within the agency today. It's also unclear whether the next step will be a further proposal or a finalized a version of the new CSA SMS. In any case, what we've told DOT is we've said, listen, give carriers the time to test this. Whether you're a truck company, whether you're a bus company, we should be able to go in and see what our methodology would be in the new system. FMCSA has done that. They have on their website today where you can log in and see what your scores would be under the current proposal. Another piece of good news in the CSA SMS world is that FMCSA has proposed expansion of the crash preventability determination program. This has been that long-standing complaint from our motor carriers that you have a DOT recordable crash, and no matter whether your driver was at fault or not, it goes on your program. DOT has listened to us. They proposed a demonstration program a few years back. That demonstration program became permanent, and we've seen at least one expansion of that program so far, and this is DOT now proposing to expand the program even further. I'd say, honestly, number one complaint I hear from my perspective at ATA is that a motor carrier has a crash and they can't challenge it for review because it doesn't meet the criteria that FMCSA has established. And a lot of folks say to me, why is that the case? Why is FMCSA limited the criteria? And what it's really come down is to the ability, staffing power to go in and review each of these crashes. They're reviewed at the federal level, and that takes time. I mean, unfortunately, I wish I had a better answer for y'all, but it takes time to review each of those. So the good news is with what FMCSA has proposed in their latest expansion is to now allow any crash that has video evidence as a special category. So say, for instance, you have a crash, your driver was not at fault, and it does not meet any of the pre-established categories, but you have, say, dash cam footage that shows that driver was not at fault, the other vehicle was at fault, you would then be eligible to send that crash in for review. So I really think that's a good news perspective as far as it goes, and we're happy to see the DOT propose this. It too has not been finalized, but we're hopeful that this is one of those that would take less of an effort to make final, and the DOT can put that into place in the near future. So we'll be monitoring that and hopeful to hear feedback sooner than later. And then last but not least, on the CSA side, this is another piece of good news. In September of last year, FMCSA proposed a federal appeals process for requests for data reviews. For those of you that aren't overly familiar in this space, when you have a roadside inspection and an inspector documents a violation that you feel is not legitimate, that you feel was done in an error, you fill out what's called a data queue request, and the technical term is a request for data review. But that often goes back to the inspector, or really in most cases, goes back to the jurisdiction that actually wrote the violation. And in many cases, the actual inspector that did the violation on the roadside. So the burden is on you to prove that the inspector was wrong, and it can be a bit tricky because you're essentially calling out the inspector to say, hey, you were wrong here, we want you to correct this. And there's been frustration over the years with that. So what DOT is proposing is to create a federal appeals process to where if you submit a inspection request or request for data review at the state level and it's not overturned, the state upholds their decision, you would then be able to take that to the federal level for appeal, and whatever FMCSA decides would be the final the final determining factor. So good news on that. Again, this has not been final, but I think that's a step in the right direction, and we're hopeful that FMCSA can move that forward in due time. Shifting gears a little bit, and this is really becoming, a standard plug that I do in my updates, just because so many folks are interested. The latest from the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, which has been in place since 2020. The good news is, as I say always, the clearinghouse is working. The bad news is we continue to see a rise in the number of positives that are reported. 235,000 drug test violations have been reported as of the beginning of November of last year. And again, that goes back to 2020. Alcohol violations, 5,363. No surprise whatsoever that marijuana continues to lead the list as the top drug that comes up in DOT-regulated drug tests. Honestly, with state legalization, I don't see that going down anytime soon. But these numbers are updated usually on a monthly basis. So if anybody's ever actually interested in seeing the updates, they are on DOT's website. But what DOT has also done, and we have some effective dates coming in the near future, is they're really closing all of the loopholes that existed with the drug and alcohol testing rule to make the process, they call it the Swiss cheese model, where you have holes that are put into a good product, and this is DOT closing those up. And the big one really is going to be the compliance date of November 18th of this year, and that applies to states to essentially require a state driver's license agency. That's what an SDLA is. Requires a SDLA to pull information from the clearinghouse before issuing, renewing, or transferring or upgrading a CDL or CLP. And the SDLA is also going to receive a push notification from the clearinghouse if a driver has a violation, and will have 60 days to downgrade the CDL or CLP. So essentially what will happen is if you have a driver that goes into the state driver's license agency, say they need to renew their CDL, the state driver's license agency would be required to query the clearinghouse to see if there's any violations. And then the second part is the SDLA will receive notification when a driver has a violation and will require a downgrade of that CDL or CLP. So this is going to create a loophole that's existed from day one. Several states have already begun this process. This rule became final in 2021. It's simply that the states had until 2024 this year to comply with the rule. So again, several states have started that already, and I would expect more and more to begin that process as we go into November of this year. Related on the drug and alcohol testing front, oral fluids testing, we're very, very excited about this becoming a reality. DOT finalized this rule in May of last year. They incorporated oral fluid testing standards into the allowable alternative for, or allowable method for drug and alcohol testing. Currently, urinalysis is the only type of test that's allowed. This would now allow oral fluids in any testing situation. So for pre-employment, post-accident, etc. There was some question going into this rule whether oral fluids would only be allowed for certain testing scenarios, and ultimately it will be allowed for all testing situations. It is not required except for certain situations. So you as the motor carrier will have the ability to determine when you use oral fluids testing or if you use oral fluids testing, but you will need to have a process in place. So if there's anything I would recommend in this front, would be to work with your in-house team, work with your third parties, whoever is handling your drug and alcohol testing, to ensure that you have a process in place for oral fluids testing should you need it. It's not going to be that you can pick and choose each time you do a test. So we're urging caution with that going forward. This was effective June 1st. However, and this is a big however, HHS has not, and the HHS is the Health and Human Services Department. They're the ones that certify laboratories. They have not yet approved oral fluid labs. And we will not be able to use oral fluid testing until 2 labs are approved. The latest we heard on this, which this unfortunately has been pushed a few times, is that the end of Q1 of 2024 will have oral fluid labs approved, and that you will then be able to use oral fluids testing. So I get a number of questions all the time. Hey, Dan, when can I use oral fluids testing? And the simple answer is not until HHS approves a lab. And we're told that they are working expeditiously to get that done sooner than later. So certainly we'll send a notice out once that happens. And we're hopeful that'll happen in the coming months. And then getting out of that, just some technology stuff that I think is relevant for many of the folks that are on that are tuned in today. We've had a couple of different technology and safety devices that have been discussed within the regulations. I'd say probably the most notable was July of last year. We had an automatic emergency braking rule that was proposed. This is a joint rulemaking between DISA and FMCSA. The next steps are likely a final rule, in which time that a compliance date will be established and all the details that will go with it. The key point with this rule is that there is no retroactive requirement. This will only apply to automatic emergency braking on new vehicles going forward. So don't be alarmed if you're a fleet. It's not that you're going to have to take your old trucks in to have AEB installed. This will only apply to new vehicles going forward, of which NHTSA and FMCSA will establish the deadlines for that. Again, we're hopeful we'll probably see a final rule on this, I would guess, by mid 2024. This is something that both agencies have indicated that they want to get out as soon as possible. Speed limiters. We've been talking about speed limiters for a few years now. Really, the latest update on this is there is no update. The last round of rulemaking on this was in 2022, where an advance notice of supplemental proposed rulemaking was introduced. No maximum speed was established in that. The latest, or rather the next step, was to be a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking, which was scheduled for the end of December. That date has obviously come and gone. We still have not seen the proposal from the agency. A lot of folks are asking, what does that mean? And really, I say all the time, the dates that DOT publishes, you should take them with a grain of salt, because they're very fluid. A lot can go into when a rulemaking is actually published or not. And with speed limiters, the only other thing I can say really is that like SFD, safety fitness determination, this is a big lift on the agency. This is not, as you know, a straightforward rule. There's a lot of considerations that go into it. such as speed differentials and what happens when you have split speeds out there. So I can only attribute the delay with DOT really working through it and wanting to get it as close to possible, as close to right as possible, if there is such a thing. So we're monitoring it. ATA has their own policy with it. If we have to oppose the final rule, we will. But we're going to wait and see what DOT comes up with and kind of stay in a holding pattern until that happens. And then last but not least, on the safety and technology side of things, we've been doing a lot of work with NHTSA lately with regards to a proposal that they put out in April of last year related to side underride guards. This is a concept that has been discussed for a number of years, being pushed primarily by some advocacy groups. And it's unfortunate because these are really horrible crashes that result in a car, a passenger vehicle going under the side of a tractor trailer, that this would mandate a guard to prevent that from happening, which, in all honesty, at face value seems like it makes sense, but there are numerous concerns that have been raised from an operational standpoint and cost standpoint with installing these. On the operational side, what happens when you go over railroad crossings, you have high centering events. And really, from our perspective, we'd like to focus on preventing that crash from happening in the first place versus trying to mitigate it after it's already happened. But regardless, we are part of an advisory group that reports to NHTSA, and we'll be making recommendations on side underride guards. We did respond to the rulemaking that NHTSA put out in April, in which they cited, and this is their own rulemaking, you don't see this that often, they cited a net negative cost estimate as a result of installing side underride guards. So it's not often you see a federal agency put out a notice of proposed rulemaking in which they say this will be a net negative benefit to industry. So I think that's pretty telling there from that perspective. But in any case, we're part of the conversation. The advisory board meets. We last met, I believe, in November, and I would expect a meeting probably next month sometime, although nothing's been official with that regard. And last but not least, this is something I usually always like to end my updates with. This is what's called the DOT agency rule list, and this was updated in December of 2023. And really, you can look at this as a wish list of regulatory items that the Department of Transportation wants to accomplish in the coming year. I should say years plural, because much of this will span well beyond 2024. Just because you see this on a list doesn't mean that it's a given or that it's an automatic that we'll see a rulemaking, but you can at least see what the latest stage of the proposal was, what the next stage would be, and the projected publication date. I'd be remiss not to say once again that those publication dates can mean a whole lot of nothing. Look at speed limiters, for instance. Projected publication date was December of 2023. That's come and gone. Another one on the CDL testing flexibilities that was proposed for November. That's come and gone as well. But at least gives you an idea of some items DOT wants to work on. And that's also public as well. And this is updated usually twice a year or so. And we put that out when it is. So with that, I know that was a little less than normal, but I wanted to highlight on the primary things that we've been working on. And before we close things out, I believe we had a couple of questions that have come in. So with that, I am happy to answer anything that we may have received. So Tom, I will turn it back to you, sir.
Great. Yeah. Again, thank you as always for being a part of this. And that was great information. So like you said, Dan, we've got a couple of questions here. First question, is video showing that it's not the driver's fault an automatic overturn for the carrier?
Yeah, great question. That's something I actually usually comment on when we're talking about that. So the answer is no. And that would be primarily for situations where another violation existed that let's say, for instance, the driver had an expired med card. That crash may very well not have been his or her fault, but they have an expired med card. And in the eyes of DOT, they treat it just as if that driver should have never been there in the first place. The crash wouldn't have happened. So it's something I tell any carrier when you submit a crash for review, make sure everything's in order. Make sure that there were no other violations, no out of service violations that existed before you submit that. So yeah, certainly it's not a given if there's another violation that existed. Great question, though.
Got it. How does the upcoming presidential election impact the rulemaking process?
Yeah, great question. So what will primarily likely happen, and this is true of any administration, regardless of what takes place in November, is the agencies are going to, I don't want to say rush, but they're now on the clock to get any rulemaking that they once published. I'd say even in the summer, they're really going to want to get rulemakings published by early summer, because what happens is as we go into closer to the election year, we start to see really what's considered a regulatory freeze. And especially if we see a change in administration, and again, that's if we see a change in administration in November, what happens is the regulatory freeze is issued by the president-elect, and the agencies can't put anything out until it's approved and reviewed by the new administration. So it's encompassing of any agency, not just DOT. So the agencies are going to want to get stuff published into place sooner than later, because it does run the risk of items not ever seeing the light of day if we see a change in administration. Great question.
Do carriers need to do anything to comply with the CDL downgrade rule by this November?
Yeah, another good one. I mean, the easy answer is no. This primarily is on the state driver's license agencies. There's really going to be no impact. It's not like carriers have to do any registration or check in with the states. This is primarily a state impact at the state driver's license agency. So carriers at this point don't need to take any action unless the state issues some directive, which I have not heard of, but crazier things that happen. So, but at this point, no.
Okay. Is fentanyl going to be added to the DOT panel? We're hearing a lot about that this year.
Yeah, another good question. So ATA actually filed comments supporting the addition of fentanyl to the drug and alcohol testing panel. This was reviewed by the Drug and Alcohol Testing Advisory Board, which is part of HHS. They had a meeting, I believe it was in December, to discuss adding fentanyl. We filed supportive comments. There were a few concerns that were brought up with testing of fentanyl, but overall, we support it. We support the addition, and my crystal ball says it's going to happen sometime in the near future. So I do think it's going to be added.
With oral fluid being added as a drug testing option, is hair going to be added as well?
We sure hope so. And the technical answer is they're completely separate and different. Just because oral fluids is on there doesn't mean that that's a given that we'll see hair testing. We've been pushing hair testing. I think I've talked about hair testing nearly every time I've given this update. It is in regulatory limbo, not to point fingers, but it's HHS that's been holding this up. There was a proposal in 2020, which in our opinion was just not favorable. It would have required a secondary confirmation test anytime the hair test was positive. And it would be required to be urinalysis or oral fluids. And anything we know about hair testing, we know that it's much more thorough. So you're going to have situations where the hair was positive, urinalysis or oral fluids was negative. So that was another one. The scheduled publication was last year. We still have not seen it. There's a number of concerns that have been within the rule that HHS tells us they're working through, but we're not giving up. I mean, we're still pushing. We think that this is a huge impact to highway safety. And if we're going to be realistic about talking about driving down a number of fatalities we're seeing on the roadways, hair testing is a very real part of that discussion.
Yeah, completely agree. We've heard oral fluid's going to be usable in a few months for several months. Is Q4 actually going to happen?
Yeah, so I'm not going to put money down on it, but I do think it's going to be this year. I'm confident that the labs will be approved this year. I've never heard HHS tell me specifically that they're working expeditiously on something, and they've said that of this process with getting the labs approved. It would be a shame to have come all this way and then lab process get held up. Every time I see the Federal Register notice public on the labs, I get excited to read it. So the latest, I think, on the slide I had, end of Q1 was the proposal or something like that. That's the latest official word from HHS, but I am hopeful this year. So if it happened by summer, I'd be happy.
Great. We've been talking about speed limiters for years. Will we see a rule anytime soon?
I do think so. That one, it was projected for December, and I think that is one that the administration, or at least the administration, has made clear to us. FMCSA, the agency, has said that they believe this is the right thing to do. So I know that they're working fast on that. We've answered a few questions from our perspective. So I do. However, I will say that if we don't see that before summer, late summer, there's a very realistic chance that it's not published before the presidential election. And if we do see a change in administration, we may never see publication.
Got it. Last question. Do you think side guards are going to happen despite the net negative recommendation?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I mean, it's pretty rare to see a proposal to where the agency in their own proposal says this is a net negative benefit. The folks that are supportive of side underride guards have called into question some of the reasoning with it. But I don't want to say definitively whether we will or will not have side underride guards. What I will say there are numerous concerns that the agency would have to address first before they mandate this. And this would probably be one of the largest mandates that we've seen in recent years as far as a technical equipment mandate on tractor trailers. So NHTSA has their work cut out for them if they're going to do that. And I want to make clear, it's not just a cost perspective. That's often thrown back in my face all the time, that all we care about in our world is cost. It's a very realistic concern from an operational standpoint. So I don't want to say one way or another, but there's a lot that's got to be taken care of before we get to that point.
Fair. Well, Dan, thank you so much for your time today. We greatly appreciate you taking a slot out of your busy schedule and sharing all of this information with our attendees today.
Absolutely. Happy to be back, and always appreciate the invite and the great questions.
Yeah. To everyone that attended, thank you for being a part of Day with DISA, and we hope to see you at more sessions throughout the week. Goodbye.